When I first joined Reddit, I enjoyed no sleep, but when I realized those stories aren't real, I lost interest. I find the honest stories much more interesting. Reality is almost always more terrifying. I have a story of my own, and it's something that has shaped the way I raise my son, how protective of him I am. The very reason I didn't have children of my own, and so I can make my home a fortress. It's a story that changed the way my own mother parented my sister and I, and something I feel thankful every day didn't go any further than it did. I was around 5 years old, and my family moved to a small town in eastern Tennessee from Baltimore city center, because my dad had been laid off. They were pregnant with my baby sister, and my mom wanted to start a new closer to her family in a more rural area better suited for raising kids. Or so they thought. My mom's sister, my uncle, my teenage cousin, and her parents all lived in the same neighborhood, and this house on a cul-de-sac had just went up for rent. My grandparents agreed to rent it for my parents until my dad could get on his feet and find work. It was a quiet neighborhood with a big yard in the back, but a very steep hill in the front. We had large steps that led up to the front door from the gravel driveway below and a covered porch. Underneath those steps was a little storage area that the porch hung over, and a door to a small basement that only spanned about to the living room, which sat atop. When I Google Maps the house now, it is completely closed in, but about 30 years ago it was only closed in right under the steps and obviously in the basement. A couple of years passed and nothing significant happened. My baby sister was getting ready to turn 2 and I was 7. My dad had gotten a decent job as a warehouse manager at the paper company and worked during the day while my mom stayed home. Just about every day, my grandmother and Aunt would walk over, and while they were inside talking and having coffee, my sister and I would usually go outside on the front porch and play with dolls, or I'd read to her while on the swing while my mom had her conversation. Usually they would migrate out to the porch and spend time with us on the porch swing until it got later into the afternoon and everyone would go home to start dinner. One afternoon, the neighbor's daughter Nikki was over and we were playing on one of those mats with tracks on it in my Hot Wheels cars. While laying down on our chests while pushing the cars around, I noticed out of the corner of my eye a small twig sticking up from a hole at the other end of the porch near the swing. I sat up and asked Nikki if she saw it too. She was a little older and knew my cousin well, so she says, "Yeah, it's probably just Devin messing with us." So we decided to walk over to the twig and pull it. Except when we did that, whoever it was below pulled the twig back hard and gave me a splinter and made me fall. My pride was wounded. I got my sister and went in to tell my mom, and then Nikki went home. I'm not sure why I didn't mention this twig incident to my mom that day, to be honest. Maybe I thought it would get my cousin in trouble. Maybe I was spooked. Or maybe I was just 7 and careless. I just can't remember what I was or wasn't thinking. A couple of days later, I was outside on the porch alone while my sister napped, panning on an easel I had gotten from my grandmother. My mom was inside cleaning and I noticed again this twig sticking up from the hole. Mind you, there were roughly 20-some-odd steps to our porch, so it's not like we were right on the ground. Someone had to be down there poking it up through the hole. I walked over to it and got down on my knees and said, "Devin, you're not going to give me a splinter again? I'm telling my mom." And that's when whoever it was replied to me in almost a whisper, "I'm not Devin." "Who's Devin?" His voice sounded so low and scratchy that I couldn't quite make it out, so I leaned down and looked through the hole. I didn't see anyone, so I said, "What? Who's down there?" And he said, "Come down here. I want to play with you." I said, "I'm telling my mom," and he very angrily replied with, "If you tell anyone I'm down here, I will get you." So I screamed right in and I told my mom. She came outside and looked around but didn't see anyone. She called my dad, who was at work at the time, and he came home early. They still didn't see anyone, but they did see the long twig under the porch and an old table that had been up against the house moved into the middle. I remember my mom calling my aunt and telling her to tell my cousin to knock it off and stop messing with us, but I figured my aunt never said anything, otherwise they would have known it wasn't him. About a week passed by and I had been so creeped out that I hadn't gone back outside at all. But time heals all wounds, I suppose, because when Nikki called and asked if I wanted to come over to her house to watch Lion King and build a fort in the living room, I was all in. Her dad worked graveyard, so whenever her mom would go somewhere during the day, it was so much fun to hang out with her. Her dad would sleep and we would sneak and drink Coke and eat the candies with the jelly in the middle from her parents' office. As long as we were quiet, and I called my mom before I left so she could watch me walk back over. My mom watched me walk over and we built a fort to pretend we were lions while we watched the movie. We were about halfway through the movie when we heard a knock at the door. We knew we couldn't open up the door or wake up her dad, so Nikki stood away from in a bed and called out, "Who is it?" thinking it may have been my mom. We didn't see anyone's shadow through the curtain on the door and we were too spooked to look when there was no reply. When they didn't knock a second time, we got back in our sheep fort and carried on. But a few minutes later, we heard something under the house banging on the floor of the living room. Our houses were exactly the same layout and the living rooms were directly over our small basement areas. We screamed and ran into her dad's room to wake him up. He got up and got a baseball bat and went to look outside. When he went to look into the basement, the door was wide open and it was obvious someone had been living in there. At the time, I didn't know what they found. I just assumed he'd made a bed and was someone homeless. My mom rushed over and they called the police. The cops took my statement from a previous week and as kids we were kept out of the mix. There were whispers and we ended up moving to what is still my parents' current home a couple of months later. Nikki's family left that day and never stayed in their house ever again. It must have really screwed with them because I ended up hearing that they divorced and Nikki was arrested in early adulthood for something pretty terrible. A few years ago at a family reunion, the story came up and my parents told my sister and I that when they opened the basement, there were thousands upon thousands of child porn pictures scattered everywhere and photos of us three girls playing on the porch and riding bikes, and photos of other kids at the park. They ended up finding him and arresting him a few blocks away from our house later that week. He was convicted of numerous sex crimes, including the rape of an 11-year-old girl in a neighboring city. A total sicko. I'm a 27-year-old female. At the time this occurred, I was a senior in high school, angsty and steadily into partying. For the story, I'm going to hide her identity. So what we do to the rules on Reddit. Let's call her Kay. Kay almost cost me my life and I never want to see her again. A little backstory on Kay. She had grown up privileged, given anything she ever wanted. Her parents adopted her 5 cousins and this is when she started to rebel. Her parents, who were well off, started to pay less attention to her, so Kay had all the freedom in the world. At the time this incident occurred, Kay was 18 and I had just turned 18. We were headed to a kickback at these guys' house and nothing more than a little bit of weed was expected. Now, I had my share in smoking weed, popping pills here and there. I had just tried ecstasy the summer prior. However, I was planning on staying sober. My friend Shay picked me up and we stopped to buy cigarettes at a gas station. I bought a fountain drink, one with a straw and everything. This is crucial for later in the story. We arrive at the apartment and everyone is smoking, including Kay, but I declined. She would always say shit about how she never wanted to be high alone. Complained about how I never got as high as her. So I obliged and I cleared the bong off her hit, not even taking a full hit. She asked for a drink of my soda and I handed it to her. She had it for a good minute. I had my head turned talking to someone at the kickback. When I looked back at Kay, she was messing with my straw. I didn't think much of it and she handed it back to me. Within about 30 minutes or so, I started to feel intensely high, to the point that I needed to escape from the group. I go out front to smoke a cigarette only to find out that I couldn't stand up, so I laid on the front porch. Then all of these dark thoughts flashed through my mind. I felt so sick, like my stomach was being torn open. I couldn't stand up. I had to crawl to the bushes to throw up. I thought to myself, all of this off clearing a bond. So I laid back on the porch. The apartment was located on a busy street in the city I live in. I also thought about running into traffic because I felt like I was dying. So I gave myself two options. I could run into traffic, have a car hit me and end this horrible pain I was in, or I could get some help and maybe flag someone down. My mind wasn't in the right state. I knew nobody at the kickback would take me seriously. I knew something was terribly wrong. I thought about calling my mom. I must have dialed her number and hung up like 5 different times. Finally, I called and told her what happened and that I didn't know why I was so high. Nobody else was feeling the way I felt. What seemed like an eternity later, Kay came outside looking for me. As I'm puking my guts into the bushes, she asked if I want to get some food. I asked her if she was serious. She laughed as I puked. What I didn't know is that my mother had called my older brother to pick me up since he lived close to where I was. He showed up with a machete, ran inside, and threatened people. He didn't know who gave me what. It wasn't until I got home that my brother took one look at my eyes and noticed how dilated my pupils were. That rushed me to the ER, after more puking, of course. My memory there is a bit fuzzy. I just remember asking my sister-in-law if I was going to die and telling her that I was scared. They ended up sedating me due to the fact that I was yelling and threatening the nurses. Totally out of character for me. They did a drug test and found MDMA along with other drugs in my system. I'm assuming the other drugs were the ones used to make up the ecstasy. Now, this is all frightening and everything. However, what I found out a few days later shocked me to my core. Kay had been to a house party the next night. Somebody there said she had been passing out free ecstasy to 4 different people. Of those 4 people, 3 had grand mal seizures and had to be taken to the ER by ambulance. I'm assuming that whatever ecstasy she used was a bad batch. Remember when she asked to have a drink of my soda? I assume this is when she dropped the pill inside and it dissolved. She probably crushed it beforehand or something. I have no clue, but at this time in my life I hadn't done drugs for quite a while, especially not ecstasy. Kay also went on to tell people that I was the one that subbed her the drug and she had to go to the hospital. She has a pathological liar and had to go to therapy for a long time for mental disorders. All of this happened because she wanted me to be high like her. I could have committed suicide because I wasn't in the right frame of mind. That still affects me to this day. That sounds cliché, but I have a hard time trusting people with this experience and among other things. I also don't like sharing drinks with my friends. I get scared whenever I go out to a bar or club, fearing for the worst. I mean, if my own friend had done this to me, what's stopping a stranger? So I always guard my drink, no matter what. I served in the Marines from ages 18 to 28 when I was honorably discharged due to pinched nerves in my back, which led to surgery. Thankfully, surgery worked for me, and while I recuperated, I took a job as a driver for an assisted living facility. Technically, I worked for 2 sister companies, which were a 35 to 45-minute drive from one another, and I would drive meds, patients, etc. between the 2 facilities. Usually I worked the day shift, however, the night shift driver suddenly quit without warning, and I was asked while I found someone to cover his shift. One night I was asked to drive some meds between Site A and Site B. No biggie. I happily hopped in the van and headed to Site B. In order to get to Site B, I had to drive through a heavily forested area. It was spooky, but as a former Marine and someone who grew up in the boondocks, I don't scare very easily. Or so I thought. I'm listening to a book on tape as it was an older van with just a CD player. The radio didn't work very well, and this is before XM became the thing. I hear some rustling in the back of the van. Now, a month prior, a squirrel had somehow made his way inside the van. I thought maybe it was another one and the sound stopped, so I shrugged it off. I'm driving through the forest lost in thought when something bites me hard on the back of my neck. I swerve the car, almost smashing into another car. My heart is beating a million miles a minute and I immediately pull over. I run out of the car and open the back. I'm expecting a rabid squirrel, but sitting there with a blank expression on her face is Agnes, a woman with severe mental issues and was a resident. She began muttering, "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be here." She had bit my neck, and what was more disturbing was that she had a knitting needle in her hand. She must have taken it from another resident. I ended up calling two of the staff who worked the ward she lived in, and they ended up coming to get her. That talked her down into giving them the needle and managed to get her back into the facility. I had to go get my bite looked at, and I ended up quitting a few months later after yet another crazy incident. I stayed far away from Agnes the rest of my time there. I had my first real boyfriend when I was in high school, and we stayed together all the way till university and when we both started working. A few months into both of our first jobs, we started drifting apart and getting into plenty of arguments, but still didn't quite call it quits. Probably because neither of us really had the heart to. As I started to get to know my colleagues, I found myself spending more time with them and less time with my boyfriend. Part of my group of colleagues was an older guy. I was 20 and he was 37, who was pretty good looking but serious and quiet. Probably because he just joined the company as well. One day he starts messaging me for work-related stuff, and then we start talking about other stuff. Pretty soon we chatted quite frequently. I would say there was mild flirting, but it was mostly just getting to know each other. My relationship with my boyfriend did not approve, and one morning before work he decides to break it off. I was super distraught at work, panicking and realizing that I wasn't ready to end the relationship yet. My colleagues decided to take me out for after-work drinks to calm me down, and I did drink quite a lot. I'm not really a drinker, so getting me drunk is easy, albeit rare. I couldn't really drive in that sort of condition, so the older guy volunteered to drive me home. Everyone else starts to leave, and soon it's just the two of us in the bar. I tell him that I want to leave already because it was getting late. I actually wanted to go home and talk to my boyfriend about getting back together, but he convinces me to drink more, which I stupidly do. The rest of the night remains a haze, as I really don't remember what happened after that, but all I know is that I woke up the next morning in an unknown motel naked next to the older guy. He wakes up with a smile and begins to Germanly tell me how we made love passionately and so on. I'm filled with horror because I just couldn't remember a lot of things from the night before. All I could remember was crying the whole night, and I do recall telling him repeatedly that I really wanted to go home, but till today it's just a frustrating blur. I start crying and he panics and starts driving me back to my parents' house. Before I get out of the car, he leans over to kiss me on the lips, but I avoid him and rush out. A few minutes later, I receive a text from Em of him telling me how much fun he had and how he was in love with me. I was super creeped out and told him that I wasn't ready for another relationship, but we could stay friends if he liked. Well, after that, he would text me multiple times a day, even at work, telling me how much he loved me. I tried my best to avoid him, but I didn't tell anyone about what happened, so I couldn't stop him from coming along to our colleague outings. I began to dread those as well, because he would always try to sit next to me during meals or meetings and would quietly slip his hand under the table to stroke my thighs or crotch. Once, when it was just the two of us in the office elevator after work, he suddenly pushed me back and started kissing me and squeezing my breasts, stopping only when I pushed him away, making excuses that I was worried that we might get caught by others. Looking back now, I don't know why I didn't just leave or tell somebody, but I was really young. It was my first job, and I really didn't want people knowing that I slept with this stranger at work. I was so stupidly conscious of being labeled a slut. This goes on for a few months, and I never did anything while he continued. I reconciled with my boyfriend, and we soon moved back in together. When older guy found out that I got back with my boyfriend, that's when things started to get crazy. He found out where we lived, and I would catch his car across the street many nights, and he would stay in his car all the way till the morning. On weekends when we went out for meals, I would suddenly see his car parked where we were eating, or he would suddenly be seated behind the same cinema. He even followed us to church once, and that still gives me the chills because I had not expected that at all. He seemed to appear at the most random places, so to me it felt as though I couldn't escape him both at work and outside of work. I was always constantly looking over my shoulder but never confronted him because I didn't want my boyfriend to find out. Older guy kept telling me about how passionate I was during our night together that I soon became scared that I had really acted that way and didn't want my boyfriend to find out and leave me, although I'm very sure that I was too drunk to be anywhere near as passionate as he described. His messages and phone calls became more frequent. I was so scared of the whole thing coming out in the open, so I would reply to his texts and calls, which mainly consisted of him breaking down on the phone demanding that I leave my boyfriend and all his undying love declarations. I then found out a few weeks later that I was pregnant with my boyfriend's child. We were of course happy and decided to have a small wedding. When older guy found out, he became convinced that the child was his, so he started cornering me at work, telling me that he loves me and the child, about how much he loves our child, that he would marry me, that he was already planning to get a home for us, and that he already had the perfect name for our child, etc. The final straw was when he suddenly showed up at my front door with a ring and hysterical about wanting to marry me. I was really scared, but I managed to put him off by telling him that I would think about it, and he demanded a kiss, which I gave him just so he would go away. That incident really freaked me out, so I finally decided to tell another male colleague of mine about this, and he went to talk to older guy and try to threaten him to get him to stop this bullshit. I couldn't take the pressure of dealing with him anymore, so I decided to quit my job. He didn't stop messaging me and showing up at random places / my home, but thankfully we moved to a new place after our wedding. I took the opportunity to change my phone number as well. He resorted to emailing me poetry and long emails about still wanting to get together, but I was so far removed from him that I could ignore him. Thankfully, he seemed to give up after that. My male colleague informed me that the older guy decided to migrate to another country due to being so heartbroken. Not like I cared. Life went on after that. I had my child, whom I loved to death, and a fulfilling marriage with my boyfriend, now husband. That was until I attended my former colleague's wedding, and there he was. I felt my heart drop to the floor, but tried not to show it because I had my husband and child with me. We were seated on the same table the whole night, and I caught him staring at me many times throughout the night. The worst part was when I left to go to the bathroom and then returned to see him cradling my baby in his arms. He had asked my husband if he could hold the baby and kept snuggling against my child. I quickly took my child away from him and told my husband that I wanted to leave early as I wasn't feeling well. My husband did ask who the older guy was, but I brushed him off by telling him that it was some colleague that I never really spoke to at work. Nothing happened after that until I suddenly received a text message a few days later from a random number asking how I was doing. I asked who it was, and I got a reply telling me that it was him. I ignored the message and the next day changed my number again. I still received random emails and texts from him over the years, and I've changed my numbers so frequently, but thankfully besides that, nothing has happened. It's been a few years now since the very last message. I do get nightmares every once in a while with him suddenly appearing again, and I do get paranoid about him showing up, so I sometimes find myself checking the surrounding cars when I'm out. The most recent thing I heard about him was when my male colleague messaged me a few months ago to let me know that he had been messaging the guy, and he wanted to know if there was still a chance of us getting back together. I wish I could somehow erase that nightmarish year out of my life, but what's done is done. So please, older guy who made that year a living hell for me, let's never, ever fucking meet again. So this happened 10 or so years ago. I have a bad memory, so I will try to recount to the best of my ability. When I was 14, I befriended a girl named Rebecca. Now, Rebecca came from a shitty home. Her clothes were always dirty, she never had lunch, and she sure did have a mouth on her. We were friends though, and everything was sweet. My mom had a bad upbringing as well, so she didn't mind Rebecca coming over to have dinner with us every night. On more than one occasion, my mom bought clothes and underwear for her. I cannot stress this enough. We treated her like family, which makes what happened all the more fucked up. Rebecca and I ended up having a falling out. She dropped out of school and I didn't see her for a while. Fast forward a few months and I'm waiting at the bus depot to go to a mate's house. I see Rebecca and she's hanging out with a group of girls who come from a well-known violent family. These girls were always picking fights, intimidating others, and just generally shitty people. The kind of people who start a fight if you looked at them for a second too long. I didn't want to look at them, but I could see in my periphery that they were all looking in my direction, pointing and laughing. I decided to walk to the bay where my bus was supposed to be, and they followed. Just before my bus pulled up, the leader of the pack came up to me and said something about her knowing that I called her a slut and I was gonna get what's coming to me. Now, I'd never said a word about her in my life. It was obvious Rebecca was the one feeding her these lies. This went on for a while. I would be hanging out at the local shopping center or be at the bus depot and see them in the distance, causing me to hide or run. Sometimes they would see me and run after me. Other times they would just yell out at me. I didn't know what it was at the time, but my anxiety was crippling. I was constantly terrified. So one day I'm in a jewelry store with a friend and I woke up and see Rebecca and one of those girls walking past the shop. I immediately turn around in hopes that they wouldn't recognize me, but it was too late. Rebecca came in and starts letting out this stream of abuse at me, telling me that she's gonna beat the shit out of me, that I'm a slut and a cunt, etc. My friend ran away and I'm looking at the shop workers with pure terror on my face, but all they're doing is telling me to get out because they don't want us to break anything. I felt so alone. Rebecca's friend is egging her on, telling her to give it to me before security comes. I can see that Rebecca has hesitance, but she also wants to seem tough in front of her friends. Now I don't know if it was the adrenaline going through me or she just threw a shitty punch, but I managed to grab her fist before it hit my face. I think it surprised us both. Rebecca and her friend run away. I'm crying. The shop people are yelling at me to leave, but the girls might still be in the shopping center and I'm so scared to run into them again. I ended up leaving and calling my mom on a payphone. She knew what had been happening, so instead of catching a bus home, she said she'd pick me up. Our house is a 10-minute drive from the shops, but Mom didn't show up until 15 minutes or so. When I got in the car, I was frantic, asking my mom why she took so long, etc. She informs me that she was driving. She saw Rebecca and the other girl walking. She pulled up and yelled out to Rebecca to leave me alone. Rebecca tells my mom to fuck off, so my mom grabs her by the shirt, pulls her close, and says it again, while also adding that she'll personally flog Rebecca if she ever tries to hurt me again. My mom is an incredibly kind and patient woman, but she will not tolerate bullshit towards her kids. I constantly see all the other girls, but I haven't seen Rebecca in years, and I hope I never do again.